people delayed, but we're going to start anyway. I'm going to make a dramatic statement tonight. In fact, we're going to have fun tonight. Yeah. All over. So anybody who's not here tonight, it's their loss. We're all going to go home feeling really good tonight, I promise you. And what I'd like to tell to our people who are, Mike, are we online now? So, you know, we have a handful of people in the room. We have several hundreds watching us live streaming. And since that's the bigger audience, and since I know these people know what I'm going to say, I'm going to make sure I look at you online from time to time to understand what I'm saying. Our Constitution has been under attack, and thereby our country for decades, for at least 100 years, if not since its very inception. It's the truth, right, Charlie? You know that. You've been around for those 100 years. So, when you think of groups like this, and this is really even more to the people who are in the room here tonight. When you think of groups like this, that's just a little group. We're just doing our little thing. I want you to understand something. There are many people out there who don't understand this. I think all of the people in this room do. And that is, this is a big deal. We're only doing our little part, but we're pulling our weight. You know, big changes don't come to that. I mean, we're in the midst of a big change right now in this country. And it's not like in Egypt where it's being pushed by a military coup every few years. Or it's not like in South America where there's a military coup, seems every few hours. All right? We're doing it here in this country, and it's not from the top down. It's not from the top down. It's from little groups like this, all over the country, that are doing what? That are pulling your weight. Mike, pull your weight, make sure that camera stays on the screen. So this is not a little deal. This is a big deal. We've had this room filled with 80 people. We've had it with 20 people. We've had it with 15 people. But those 15 and 80 people go out and spread the word. And they come and they learn. And I learn as I'm presenting this stuff. And we have great speakers who come and spread the word. The change that's happening in this country is because we're all pulling our own weight with groups like Act for America, the Durst, I say it, the Upper Cape Tea Party, Liberty Chalkboard, and We the People. So pull your weight, attend. We have membership renewals coming up in January for everybody here who's already a member. And for all you who are online and who are watching this, I'm going to appeal to you. Please go ahead to our website, WTPOCC, We the People of Cape Cod.org, and subscribe. Send $10 donation to this organization. Pull your weight, because that's what we're all doing. And lest anybody think that it's not working, just take a look at the world around you. Things are changing, and they're changing for that. So, thank you for that. You know, next year was, to be honest with you, was going to look tough for us. We're a small organization, but we've had a couple of board meetings, and all of a sudden, inspired, things are looking good for next year. We have a possible, I mean, the schedule is potentially almost filled already. And we're looking to reach out, and with good reason to expect that they're going to accept speakers like David McCullough, who lives here on the Cape, not on the Cape, on the Vineyard, right? And Nathaniel Philbrick, who wrote the book The Mayflower, and McCullough wrote the book John Adams, the biography. So, you know, we're always working hard and always struggling, but 2019 is going to be a very good year. So pull your weight, get involved, send in a check, make a donation, subscribe, attend, and spread the word. Now, with that little speech, let's get to tonight. Okay, what's the subject? Elections. So we're going to have a little bit of fun tonight because, you know, we're going to look at several aspects of this. How the Constitution directly addresses the electoral process. We're not going to spend all night on that. That can be pretty dry. I'm tired of dry stuff. We're gonna have fun tonight. Other provisions that affect the elections indirectly, and yeah, they're directed at the elections, not like they're cryptic or anything, but I'll talk about a couple of those items later that are not necessarily in Article 1 of the Constitution. How in turn, and we're talking about congressional elections. This is a midterm election. How in turn elections impact constitutional matters. And I'm going to lower the light up in front of the screen, so I'll disappear from you for a moment. How's that, a little better? And then here's where the fun is going to happen right here. I'm going to spend a little time on the anticipated impact of our upcoming elections on our constitutional republic. That's going to take up about half of tonight's talk. Yours truly has been doing some analysis. I hate to toot my own horn, but in 2014, I said we were going to pick up 9 seats in the Senate. Oh, I shouldn't say we, because this is a nonpartisan organization. I said the Republican Party was going to pick up 9 seats in the Senate. They picked up 9. In 2016, yeah, I was right again. So I'm not a genius. It only takes a little common sense and to look at things a little bit differently than the way that the talking heads are telling you to do it on the airwaves. So we're going to spend a little time with that, and we're all going to leave happy tonight with that. So let's look at a few of the ways that the Constitution directly addresses our electoral process. And I'm just going to read through right now Article 1, Section 2 with you. It says, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. There's a few important points we're going to focus on, or at least mention in the following notes. First of all, it says, by the people. That has tangible meaning. Okay. Secondly, the qualifications requisite. That means the people that are voting have to have certain qualifications. Okay. And like you have to be an American citizen, right? At least that's what we would like to think, since we the people meant we the American people, we the people of the United States of America. And you know, every 2 years we get to, so let's go ahead and look at a couple or a few points to note about Article 1, Section 2. First of all, governors are not allowed to appoint. If there's an unexpected vacancy, like an appointment to a cabinet position, like we've seen this past year and a half, or a death, governors are not allowed to appoint successors to that House of Representatives seat. Why is that? Because it says right in Article 1, Section 2, House of Representative members are to be elected by the people, not by the governors, not by the legislatures, not by anything else, by the people. So when a member leaves the House, a special election has to be called. The governor and or the legislature collaborate to establish, to enact that special election. But there's got to be a special election, period. And that's why over the past year and a half, we've seen about, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 special elections around the country as people got appointed to cabinet positions. Now, the original Constitution gave broad powers to the states regarding qualifications, and they've been restricted over the years. So the way to read this is that, you know, as of the ratification of the 15th Amendment, we're not allowed to restrict people from voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's the third of what we call the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War. Item number 2, sex. That's suffrage. So the first one was ratified in 1870. The next one in 1920 is women's suffrage. And that says that you cannot restrict the qualifications that we're placing upon the electorate, the voters. Must not include sex. And that's a more difficult subject these days, isn't it? Male or female, I was going to say. But nowadays it's male or female and the 80 in between. Non-payment of a poll tax, that's the 24th Amendment. That was around as late as 1964. Now, people have this idea about the poll tax that it was all about keeping certain groups from voting. It was not as simple as that. Aside from property taxes, remember, originally in this country, the federal government derived its revenue by tax from the states. The states were responsible for taxes. Well, it turns out poll taxes were a way to ensure more taxes coming. It was about money. You know, does that surprise anybody? It was because you couldn't register without, you know, paying the poll tax. It was one of the largest sources of revenue for the federal government, aside from property taxes. So it wasn't just about shaping the electorate. Although, let's be honest, that was part of it too. Last but not least is anyone over the age of 18. This is the 26th Amendment, and that was enacted in 1971 or 73, I forget which, I think it was 73. Tremendous pressure on the government and the Congress, particularly in light of the draft and the Vietnam War. And people, very reasonably, gotta say, said if we can put a gun in that person's hands, tell them to go off and kill in defense of this country, then they should be able to vote too. I would argue that they should be able to get a beer in a bar as well. So those are some of the qualifications. Here are some of the other qualifications for the candidates, and that is for the House of Representatives, the candidate has to be, or a House member has to be 25 years or older, must be a U.S. citizen for 7 years, and a resident of that state, not of that district necessarily. We're going to talk about districts a little bit later, but of the state. And then it also says in Article 1, Section 2, representatives and taxes shall be apportioned according to relative size of the states. That's the basis for taxation and representation. All right? Article 1, Section 3 deals with the Senate. And I'll read through it with you. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature. And of course, that was obviated or superseded by the 17th Amendment. But everybody in this room knows, although maybe some people who are viewing online don't know, that prior to the 17th Amendment, senators were selected by the state legislatures. They're off for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. There's an interesting thing or two about that whole thing. Every 2 years during congressional elections, 1/3 of the Senate is up for election. How did we arrive at that? So originally, there were 2 senators from every state. And when they made the provision that we're going to have 1/3 of the Senate up for election each time, what they did simply, simple and commonsensical, was simply to, by drawing lots, divide the Senate into 3 classes. And the only, the conflict they had to avoid is that you don't want more than 1 senator from a given state coming up in a given year. So they were divided into 3 classes, and in no single class could both senators from a single state be. And that's how it's been every 2 years for a cycle of 6 years, an overall cycle of 6 years since the beginning. Now, the protocol for filling a vacant Senate seat has changed in response to the 17th Amendment. So before, the legislature or governor could have appointed a replacement senator. But now the senators are elected by the people, and so there has to be a special election. But in a nod to the old system, what they did was they said, but the governor can appoint an interim senator until there's a writ for a special election. And that's why you see, like you've seen before, with McCain's passing recently, and John Kyle was appointed as the senator as replacement. Just until, it's not going to happen this year, but 2 years after that, and John Kyle will be up for election. We're going to call that the special election. There's a lot of latitude given to the states.
So he's not up this year?
No, he's not. Yeah, I know, I thought that too.
That's because the other senator is up this year.
That's correct. You're right.
So we put them in the same year.
You're right. And that's probably why they were probably forced to put it 2 years further down the line. Good point, Sylvia, thank you. Yeah, because I was wondering about that myself. All right. And the qualifications for the candidates that you had to be 35 years of age at least, and that you had to be a citizen of the United States, and that you had to be a resident of the state that you're running for Senate. That's all common sense. Let's look at the next thing. We're going to cut loose in a few minutes and freewheel it a little. But right now, we're just going to go through this step by step. Article 1, Section 4 also addresses our elections, our congressional elections. Again, to read through it, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the place of choosing senators. So, what are the important points in that? Well, first of all, Article 1, Section 4, which is known as the election clause by some, if not all. I'm not a constitutional scholar, so it wasn't known as the election clause to me, but it is now. Assigns the primary responsibility for the conduct of the election to the states primarily, and to the federal government only secondarily. It assigns the responsibility to the legislatures, not to the executive branch, right? I'm sorry, to the legislatures and not the executive or the judicial branches. So that's what Article 1, Section 4 does, amongst other things. And when we're talking about the manner in which elections are conducted, it means a lot of things, but here's a list of a few of them. Issuing notices about an upcoming election, dealing with voter registration and the maintenance of voter registration records and that sort of thing. The supervision of voting, which here in Massachusetts there's precious little of. Protection, but Massachusetts wants to do it that way until they get pushed by weak people, they'll do it the way they want. Until somebody takes them to court for violating the tenets of the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause, or contains the Equal Protection Clause. And that's the way to correcting a lot of these things because it's very broad in its scope. Protection of voters. So, in theory, if you step up to the polling place in Philadelphia and there happens to be someone with a military jacket swinging a billy club, and I'm not going to make any more references to that incident, in theory, the state of Pennsylvania is supposed to protect you from that individual. Yeah. Just like they're protecting drivers in Portland from Antifa. Right. Prevention of fraud. All right. I'm not even going to go there. Someday maybe I'll give a talk on voter fraud all by itself. The counting of votes, the reporting of results, and a whole host of other things that go along with running an election. Now, there's a couple of constitutional provisions I'm going to put quotes around indirect because they're in the Constitution, they're intended to deal with elections, but they also have ulterior motivation for being in there. And the impact on the election isn't as direct to some of the manner things that I listed for you a moment ago. And one of those is the establishment of congressional districts. Now, we didn't always have congressional districts in every state, although it did begin early. Not every state had separate congressional districts. Remember that the Constitution mandated that there be equal protection, that everybody's vote, essentially, the way it's interpreted, be equal. But it didn't stipulate whether a state would be apportioned its congressmen all at large, just according to the number of people in the state, or in individual districts. The Constitution doesn't do that, but the Reapportionment Act of 1829 did. Actually, there were early reapportionment acts. There was one, I think, in 1789 that George Washington signed, another in 1911, another in 1829. And I think that's the one we've been operating in under fully since then. But here's the thing, and particularly when new states were admitted to the Union, or territories were turned into states, they didn't necessarily have congressional districts right off the bat. They were just assigned a certain number of congressmen based on their population. So what the Reapportionment Act did, now up until from 1789 on through 1829, what was happening is as the country's population expanded and individual states' populations expanded, there were more and more congressional seats apportioned. And so it was getting a little bit out of hand. The Apportionment Act, or the Reapportionment Act of 1829, set a cap at 435 congressmen, and that's how it is today. For a very brief time, we had 437 when Alaska was admitted as a state, but then it was rolled back to 435. And a lot of funny things happened between then and 1829 and shortly thereafter. The Reapportionment Act of 1829 replaced the Reapportionment Act of 1811. And that set a cap on, it distributed, it apportioned the congressional seats. It also made rules about congressional districts. It said they had to be compact, whatever that might mean. It said they had to be contiguous, so you couldn't have from this part of the state and from that part of the state. There had to be roughly the same number of people in each. You had to make a case for there to be an exception. The Reapportionment Act of 1829 set the cap at 435 congressmen, and it apportioned them to the several states, but it didn't address those other things I just talked about. So I can't imagine that this wasn't intentional. On the other hand, anything's possible in this world and in politics. So when the Reapportionment Act of 1811 was replaced by the Reapportionment Act of 1829, it left us in the wilderness for a brief time because all the other provisions of the Act of 1811 expired. So we were left in the wilderness. Now, I can't even keep track of in my head how many times in the couple of years that followed, or in the few years that followed, an act was what's the word I'm looking for? Enacted to reinstate those provisions of the Act of 1811. But then they were allowed to expire. And then once again, they were renewed in the subsequent act. And so it went back and forth, but entered the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court really put an end to all that. So right now, there's no specific law on the books that's in action that dictates a lot of these things. But what we go on is the interpretation of the Supreme Court in a number of cases that makes use of the 14th Amendment to say that we are entitled to equal protection under the law and applies it to elections. And so, again, no specific act, but due to decisions by the Supreme Court, we behave like we did pretty much with the Act of 1811. Badly, that is. Okay, so how do states actually determine congressional districts? Well, in various ways. There are 37 states in which the legislature draws the districts or redraws the districts, as the case may be. 5 of those are by joint resolution of the State House and State Senate, and the other 32 are by enacting a law. But then there are other states that do it by commission. And there are what they call politician commissions, meaning that elected officials can be on the commission to draw those districts. And then there are a few states that have independent commissions, where the governor, the state house members and such are not allowed to be on the commission at all. And of course, there's gerrymandering. So like I said, congressional districts did appear early. And gerrymandering, does anybody here, well, I know some people do. Does anybody here not know where the expression gerrymandering comes from? I'll tell you. Elbridge Gerry, who was, if I'm not mistaken, the Massachusetts governor and eventually as a vice president. Wasn't he about the 5th or 7th vice president at that time? Elbridge Gerry was credited with drawing congressional districts that were described as having the shape of salamanders. And so those 2 words were contracted, and that's how we get the expression gerrymandering. We all know that it's nothing new. It's been, well, since Elbridge Gerry was around, and even before, he just did it better than anybody else. In the 1960s and 1970s, one party did it better than anybody had ever done it before. And now here we are in the 2010s, and with the aid of computers, well, the other party can do it even better. And so everybody's squawking, but it don't make no difference, because the fact of the matter is that the Constitution gives wide latitude to the states. And that's why you're going to see most of these things, as they already have been, thrown out at the level of the Supreme Court. All right, the census is one of those things I'm going to call an indirect way to address our elections. And that's because, it actually says in Article 1, Section 2, it talks about the census. It doesn't name it by name, but it says that, and I left one word out at the end here, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned. So it was a tax thing too, obviously. Again, that's how the federal government got most of its revenue, was from the states, not from individuals. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states and may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by, a decennial census. Article 1, Section 9 also mentions the census in a slightly different context. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. So let me skip ahead to the next bulleted item, the 16th Amendment, which said Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived. So there goes Article 1, Section 9 out the door, with the advent of the income tax from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. If we're going to, by Supreme Court decision, assume that the 14th Amendment and its equal protection under the law means that we all have the same electoral power, right? Then we would have to conclude that taking taxes from people not based on the census is unconstitutional. Tell that to, who was Woodrow Wilson? No, he's not around to hear it anymore. But I suspect there will come a time when this issue will be revisited, because it's clearly not taxation with representation in the strict sense of the word, or even in the semi-strict sense of the word. All right, now the fun starts. So here's the disclaimer for everybody online. Everybody in this room already knows that I'm a Republican, okay? That's the disclaimer, that's full disclosure. But what I'm gonna offer you now is an objective, independent analysis of what we're expecting to see in the near future. I'll explain why in a moment. It doesn't take a genius. Really, it just takes being able to be objective and not letting your emotions get in the way. It was the same way in science. And for those of you out there who don't know me, this is what I did for my whole career in science. You looked at that microscope, and believe me, you want to see something. And you want to say, I've got to tell you, you want to see it come out exactly like you wanted it to come out. And you may look through that microscope, you may call your research associates over and all excited. But when you go home that night, you got to start saying to yourself, I'm full of crap. That's not what I saw. Or there's more interpretations than just the one I would like it to be. And if you can't do that, you're not a scientist. There's a lot of non-scientists out there, I can tell you, and more today than there ever have been. So, what? We have elections coming?
When is the election? November 28th. I don't want to hear this.
November.
Exactly. When is the election? November 4th. Election day. Let's count that.
Yeah. So when I put that slide up on and I said, what? We have elections coming. Yeah, everybody out there and everybody here can laugh at me and say, what are you, Allegro? Come on, you know? You can see that there should be more people watching this episode right now, all right? So let's talk about, and this is critical. This is more important than the other stuff I talked to you about. Let's talk about how the elections, in turn, impact our Constitution, our perception of the Constitution, and how we enact our constitutional provisions, okay? Enforcement of our laws will be affected, right? Or non-enforcement of our laws, as the case may be. And all of them should be rooted in the Constitution. It's kind of critical. congressional acts in the House and Senate. What are we looking at? If, I could say Democrat, Republican, because I'm being objective here. If I'm not just stating fact, somebody is free to tell me and free to report me to the IRS. If the Republicans retain power in Washington, D.C., it'll be one thing, and if the Democrats gain power, it'll be another thing. And the thing that it will be, according to their own public statements, is that they will be impeaching the president, so it will impact the executive branch. They will be impeaching or attempting to impeach the newly appointed Supreme Court justice, so it's impacting the judicial branch. So congressional acts in the House and Senate will be impacted by the outcome of elections. And that's what I was just saying there with the judicial branch. And of course, you know, laws, all the myriad of laws that will or will not be passed will be impacted. And again, impact on the executive branch and the separation of powers, because if the president, for example, is not allowed to do things that the Constitution gives him the power to do because of congressional action, it impacts the separation of powers in the country. For instance, if there's trade issues or immigration issues, all of which fall within the purview of the executive branch at the moment, if we have a change of powers, we may see difficulties with that separation of powers. All right. So now we're going to spend the rest of the time. What time is it? Somebody tell me the time.
A little after 5 past.
Okay, so we have 25 minutes, that's solid half, 25 minutes, half hour to now have fun. Yeah.
Question over here. How can they impeach people with no reason to back it up?
Well, so somebody online asked, how can they impeach people with no reason to back it up? There have been impeachments before, both of presidents, like Andrew Johnson. There was no real reason to impeach him. And Supreme Court justices like Samuel Chase, back in about 1805, he was impeached. But remember, impeachment is a two-step process. The term impeachment refers to an act of Congress which essentially indicts the person under question, the federal officer under question. But then that person has to be tried in the Senate, whether you're talking about a Supreme Court justice, a congressman, or a president. And that's where the real action takes place, is that officer of the republic guilty or not? So the answer to the question is they can impeach anybody at the drop of a hat for any stupid reason. And in the House, it only requires a majority. But you got to get it through the Senate and to convict. And that just is not going to happen. So this answer to sort of the second part of your question, or the second answer to your question, is they can't. They can't. And in fact, we'll even touch on that a little bit later in the show. So what are the possible outcomes and what are the impacts it could have? What if the House of Representatives changes? We could have impeachment of officers. What if the Senate changes? Well, then it's going to be impossible to appoint anyone to the federal judiciary or even to other federal posts, relatively routine federal posts. And it could, we're going to come back to precisely what I mean by changing hands.
Like replacing the AG.
Yes, all kinds of things can happen. Now, what if the House and Senate change hands? Well, all these things become possible to some extent, depending on the political circumstances. And to that viewer, remember that impeachment is really very little more than a political action anyway. And what if there's no significant shift in political power? So let's look at the current circumstances and take a wild guess as to where we're going to wind up at the end of this. All right, so here's what the prognosticators say. All right, and what it's based upon. All right, now we know that they all talk about, not my words, a blue wave, right? We all know that, if we listen to NBC and CBS and CNN, there's going to be a blue wave. All right, what do they base that on? Well, first of all, polls. And I have up there, got a problem with that? Well, yes, because the polls are made by the same organizations that promulgate fake news, all right? CNN, NBC, CBS, the Associated Press, Reuters, on and on and on. So, let's first assume for a moment that you can believe the polls. The question then becomes, are they any good, even if they're assessed properly, even if they're not oversampling one population or another? Can you actually believe the polls? Is a poll 3 months before the election of any value?
No.
For that matter, is a poll 3 weeks before the election any value? Let me show you some data, as a scientist might show you data. All right? A lot of this is based on, again, polls, and in particular, the Real Clear Politics average of polls has become a very popular index of where things stand in people's eyes. Now, these are data from the faulty data, but data nonetheless, from the 2006 midterm election. One party did very poorly in the 2006 elections, and one party did very well in the 2006 elections. Now, let's look over here. I want you to notice a couple of things. This is 3 weeks out from the election. And what the Real Clear Politics average of polls is, it takes all the polls by all these fake news organizations, all these news organizations, and it averages them. And the idea is that if there are any outliers, this smooths out, it brings them back a little bit towards the mean, the whole number. So this is a tracking of the Real Clear Politics of the polls through the months in the year leading up to the 2006 election. So I want you to know for Republican or Democrat for Congress. No names attached, which is almost meaningless in itself. The Democrats have a 16-point lead. That suggests a real thumping, right, of historic proportions. I want you to notice another thing. In the last week or two before the election, the trend line goes up for the Republicans and it goes down for the Democrats. I want you to notice something else. The final polling on the day before Election Day, on that Monday, said the Democrats were going to win by 11.5 points in this generic poll. The election results said that they won by 7.9 points. That's a difference of 3.6 points, which means that even with this trend up for the Republicans, still on the election day, the polls underestimated Republican performance, right, by almost 4 points. Now, that's not always the case. Let's look at, this is 2010 midterm election. I want you to notice a couple of things again. The upswing in Republican support, the leveling off or downswing in Democratic support. The final polling said that the Republicans were going to win by 9.4. They actually had a generic poll advantage of 6.8 on election day, which means that it actually overestimated by a little bit the Republican performance on election day. However, still, I want you to notice, here's October, and here's election day, and look at the steepness of that curve. So the polls shifted in the last 2-3 weeks, dramatically. Let's look at the next election. This is the midterm election in 2014. What do you notice right off the bat? That in October, the red line jumped up, and the blue line stayed relatively flat. And the final polling had the Republicans up by 2.4%. This was a Republican year. On election day, the Republicans garnered a lead of 5.7%, which means that once again, the polls underestimated Republican performance on election day. What are the reasons for that? I think if you ask a Republican, particularly a conservative Republican, you'll get the answers. And nobody should know better than the person who's being asked the question. Okay? There's a lot of theories about why this happens, right? But the one reason I can tell you that I've been told by many people is when a pollster calls them up. If a pollster calls them up, they don't want to answer because they know that that polling agency is not on their side, and they're not going to volunteer, as my father used to say, never volunteer information. So when somebody who you view as the enemy calls you up to ask you for information, you're disinclined to say anything. Also, I think there's been a shame factor in the past 20, 30 years. I remember when Ronald Reagan was running for office, and at that time I was in graduate school, and a lot of my friends didn't want to say that they were going to vote for Ronald Reagan, but at the end of the day, they did. So there's peer pressure to keep their mouth shut. I think a lot of that has gone away as Republicans and the conservative wing of the Republican Party has become more vocal and understand more fully that it affects the outcome. It creates a perception. All right, let's look at 2018, where it stands. This is this year's congressional polling, generic congressional polling from Real Clear Politics. I want you to notice two things, right? The Republican approval rate or performance in these polls has been going up for a long time, but if you just look since the summer, and if you just look in October, this little blip of turf is really too small to claim that there's a trend. But you've seen the trend in all of the recent and even the previous that I haven't shown you midterm elections. And I have some sad news for the people who fit into the blue line. You see this over here, this little hump? It's going to get very sad for you. It's going to be very sad in the last few weeks before the election, because I'm going to bet. I wouldn't write a grant based on this, but I would bet that this is the beginning of a downturn over here, and this is just going to continue to go up. So the polling data has the Democrats up by 6.5 points, and this changes. I mean, just 3 weeks ago, they were up by 9 points. So it shows you how quickly it can change. There are other oddities I'll be able to discuss with you, with anyone who wants to know it. I follow this on a daily basis. It's actually humorous, the lengths and the contortions that they go through to keep this fake number propped up so that you think one side is losing and one side is winning. You'd be amazed. So we don't know what the election results are going to be. We don't know what the difference is going to be. But let me tell you what all this data is used for. What it's based upon. Well, first of all, they're saying there's going to be a blue wave because there are 23 districts in the country that were currently held by Republican incumbents, but that Hillary Clinton won in the 2016 presidential election. Well, there's a lot of problems with that because, first of all, you know that the electorate in the presidential years is not the same as the electorate in the midterm years. Put that aside for a moment, okay? They also failed to mention that there are 10 districts for which the reverse is true, that were previously Democratic-held districts, and President Trump won in 2016. What does this all mean? Well, we had an election in a state Senate district in Texas just about a week and a half ago. Anybody remember that? Have you heard about it? You know what the results were? There was a seat, the 19th Senate district in the state of Texas has been held by a Democrat for 139 years until last week when a Republican won it. That was a district that Hillary Clinton won by, I think it was 20 points, but I know it's at least double digits. So what does that even mean? What does this mean? Now held by Republicans, but you have all been involved in campaigns, and you know that what's really important is name recognition, therefore incumbency, money, and a few other things get thrown in there. Let's see what else. The other thing that they use to prognosticate with is the outcome of special elections in 2017. Well, then they should really be worried from that Senate election in Texas a couple of weeks ago, because it means that there's going to be a red wave, if you believe that. But the truth of the matter is these special elections don't indicate anything. Especially since they are weeks, months, if not more than a year before the general election day. All of this leads to a model like the following. This is from the Real Clear Politics page. And so they use all that data. And now they want to tell you, they're going to use this data to tell you which of the seats that are at risk for Republicans or Democrats. So they make this chart, and they divide it into 5 categories with about a dozen or more columns, okay? So there's, on the left, there's a category that's dark blue, and that supposedly tells us seats that are pretty safe for Democrats. All the way on the right, you have something that's very red, and that indicates the seats that are very safe for Republicans. As you move one category to the middle, it's lighter blue, and these are the seats that lean Democrat, and if you move one category into the right, it's lighter red, and that tells you which seats are leaning Republican. And then here's the basis for it all right here. This middle thing that they call toss-ups. Okay, now, I've already told you this is hogwash because it's based on older polls. I already told you it's hogwash because most of the polls are from fake news organizations. I've already told you it's hogwash because most of it is based on, the presidential election, which does not relate to the midterm election. And there are other reasons. Let's look and see if what I'm saying is true. Let's look at these 4 seats over here. California, 50th, Ohio 1st District, Wisconsin 1st District, and California 39th District, okay? They're over in the leans Republican sector now, but just a few weeks ago, they were in the toss-up. They were part of that narrative that these seats are at risk for the Republicans. Democrats could take, there were 43 seats in this toss-up column, and 40 of them were Republican. The Republicans can lose 40 seats, right? Or more. Let's look at, in a little bit of detail, some of these races. Oops. Yeah, okay, let's look at some of these races. So these have now been CYA'd into the leans Republican column. Should they have ever been in the toss-up column to begin with? Allegro's telling you no. And to prove that, we're going to look at 4 seats that are still in the toss-up column. Now, this isn't the same for every one of these. I'm going to show you a bigger data sheet in a little bit where you can just look at colors. But let's look at these 4 districts that are in the toss-up column: the Iowa 3rd, New Mexico 2nd, the Texas 23rd, and the West Virginia, I think that's the 2nd or 3rd, okay? Toss-ups? Really? Let's look at the Texas 23rd. The incumbent is the Republican Hurd. He's running against the challenger, Ortiz Jones. There's a significant fundraising difference. Now, I just put these into 3 groups, either red or blue. If there's 1 star in my chart, you're out fundraising the person by, maybe 5%, 20%. If you've got like 1.5 times what they've raised, twice what they've raised, it gets 2 stars. And if you've got 3, it means you're murdering. You've got $3 million and they have $100,000, that kind of thing. Okay. So here's an incumbent in a Republican district. He's got a very significant fundraising difference, and the only recent poll has him up by 8 percentage points. Should that be in the toss-up column? Would it be in the toss-up column if it was the other side of the coin? All right, the answer is no, and I'll show you that too. Let's look at the Iowa 3rd. The incumbent, Young, I think it's Stephen Young, versus Axney. Now, when I said this one was very significant, this one is a triple star. This individual has millions, and this person has a few 100,000. Fundraising is not only important in resources, but it's an index of the kind of support you're getting. But the only recent poll has the Republican incumbent up by 16 points. Why is that race put in the toss-up column? Okay. We can understand it might have been there for a few weeks. Why should it be there now? Right? It's because there's a false narrative that people are trying to promulgate. Let's look at the next one. Harold in the New Mexican 2, in the New Mexico's 2nd district. Harold versus Torres Small. The only recent poll has the incumbent, I don't think this is an incumbent, has the Republican candidate up by 7 percentage points. Does that look like a toss-up to you? There's only 1 poll. The district was last won by a Republican, yeah. So this is not an incumbent. Harold's not a Republican. But in the last congressional election, the Republican won this district by 26 points. How would you like to be this Torres Small person? Okay, you wouldn't want to be. The Cook Political Report, which is faulty to begin with, because it utilizes presidential year numbers, specifically presidential, has this as a Republican district, meaning that this district votes Republican by, on average, 6 points more than the average congressional district in the country. This is a heavily Republican district. The Republican won it by a massive amount last time. The polls are showing the Republican is winning. This is a toss-up. Okay, let's look at the last one. West Virginia 3.
These are House seats, right?
Yeah, these are House seats. Let's skip right to this last number here, because I think this says it all. I don't think we even need to touch upon the other points. The Republican, this is not an incumbent. The Republican won this district last election by an unbelievable 43 percentage points. What moron would ever call this a toss-up district? Well, maybe the Associated Press would, or CNN.
No more.
Right, not, right. The only recent poll has the Republican candidate up by 7. And I want you to remember that all these numbers I'm giving you, this is before the inevitable rise in the Republican numbers before the election. And the almost inevitable overperformance on election day. So if he's up by 7 here, and we use that other data I showed you, which is faulty, he's going to win by double digits. Maybe not the 43 points that the last one won by, but so the only recent poll has him up by 7. He's got a lot more money, so it's not like he's going to run out of dough between now and the next 3 weeks.
And we got a viewer in Scotland saying hello to everyone.
Regards to you. Welcome to the show here. We're glad to have you on board. Our reach is international. Make a donation. All right, let's look at this over here. This is just a spreadsheet that I've created. It's not complete because I'm still feeding data into this. But this is how I get my estimates. And I'm going to tell you, I've been closer by far than all those moron talking heads that you see. By the way, on election night, I'll be on WHDH Channel 7 News in Boston as one of the moron talking heads myself. So from 9 o'clock until 11:30, you can turn on and see me occasionally. I didn't think they were ever going to invite me back because I always beat them down. So let's look at some of these things over here. So you can't see individual numbers. Those 4 races we talked about are in here. And here's what I'm saying. This is my projection at the moment, and it could change. And it's based on more than just the things that I talked to you about. My projection is that out of those 43 seats, something like 37 of them are going to be Republican holds. And there's about a half a dozen that are truly toss-ups. Right? Now, they could go Democrat. Some of these ones that I'm currently, at the moment, calling Republican holds could flip the other way because, excuse me, we'll see what the polling says in another week or 2, and we'll see what the fundraising is, right? But let's look at one more. Leans, really, again? So this is even worse. We're not talking about the toss-up category. We're talking about this blue category over here. You see there are several red districts in there. So they're saying that these red districts are Democrat. The Democrats are going to win those pretty much. Okay? How should we look at a couple of these? Or how about if we look at a couple of these? I'm only going to show you 2 because they're races that I've become involved with recently. And they're both in New Hampshire. There's the New Hampshire 1st and the New Hampshire 2nd district. Okay? Now remember the numbers I just told you before? Polling up by 16, tons more money, highly Republican district. That's a toss-up. Here in the congressional 1st district in New Hampshire, we have Eddie Edwards. I have trouble saying that name when I was finally because we had a corrupt governor of Louisiana named Eddie Edwards. Oh no, Eddie's not that guy. He's a nice guy, well-spoken and so on. And he's running against Chris Pappas. Now, this district for the past 4 election cycles, and I don't know about before that, but for the past 4 election cycles, has been won by a Republican, then a Democrat, then a Republican, and now a Democrat. That Democrat is not running for re-election, so it's an open seat this time. So there's no incumbent, which counts for something. It's in a swing district, clearly. They're both raising money, clearly. And there's no polling. There's 0 polling, at least none that's been released publicly. Why is that in the leans Democrat column? Shouldn't that be in the toss-up column? I should add that in the previous election, the Democrat won that election by 1.3 percentage points.
Which is probably less than the margin of corruption there.
And I was going to add that. I was going to add that. We know about the thousands of seats that people voted. We know about it. This isn't just guesstimates or allegations. We know that there were thousands of people who came into New Hampshire and voted without a New Hampshire driver's license and then never got one. Previously, they allowed you to, within 90 days. You had to say, oh, I'm going to get one. I don't have it today, but I'm going to get one. All right. So why isn't that a toss-up? Why is that in the leans column? Could it be that there's a bias in the fake news? Let's look at this other one over here. This is the New Hampshire 2nd district. That's gone. That's Democrat. right? That is Ann Custer, the Democrat incumbent, running against Steve Negron, the Republican challenger. Now, that seat was won by Custer by 4.4 points in 2016. That's pretty close, especially because from what I hear, the candidate that she ran against was not a strong candidate. They're both raising money. A very interesting fact is that the Republican candidate comes from Nashville, which is the largest city in the district. So his hometown is the largest city in the district. They're both raising money, and there is no polling data. Why is that race not in the toss-up column? Why is that race not even in the leans column? Why is that case over here in the gone Democrat column? Is that fake news? All right. Here's just one specific one. I didn't even need to put this in. I should have taken it out. But here's the role that the fake news plays in this. They create the image. They create the narrative. Here's a quote from the Los Angeles Times. This is probably too small for you to read, so I put it over here. This is, but in this year, they're talking about the, I think it's the California 10th, I'm not sure. It could be California 39th, I'm not sure. But in this tough midterm election, likely to be a referendum on Donald Trump's divisive presidency. Kim will be forced, this is young Kim, she's a Republican incumbent. She won this district by double digits 2 years ago. Kim will be forced to stitch together a majority of disparate factions, diehard Trump voters, Trump-averse minorities, and affluent suburban women. Kim, 55, finds herself in a race that's virtually tied in a district where retiring GOP incumbent Ed Royce won the last election by double digits. So she's not an incumbent. The only recent polls show young Kim up by 10 percentage points. But the media plays no role in creating this narrative. It's not fake news. They're not full of crap.
You have to realize, figures do not lie. Liars figure.
Oh, this got all screwed up here, so I'm gonna have to, looks like, no, it didn't. I guess there's still some, well, yeah, there's a little bit over here. I'll explain it in a moment. Let's take a look at the Senate. We just debunked the whole idiocy of all these toss-ups in the House of Representatives. Let's debunk the idiocy of the toss-ups in the Senate. Let's begin with the biggest idiocy, the biggest folly, the biggest case study in silliness in the planet, which is the Texas Senate race between the popular in Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz, who's got national recognition, right, and is raising plenty of money, versus the ignoramus Beto O'Rourke. Okay? They tried to make this a tie. And in good news for all of us, Americans and constitutionalists, not Republicans and Democrats, constitutionalists. For all of us constitutionalists, it's good news. Because they poured and are still pouring untold millions of dollars into this race. I'm talking about obscene millions of dollars because they want to take out this Republican congressman, this Republican senator. And it ain't going to happen. So for a few months, they were able to pull off that it was a close race. But with the Republican upswing and everything else, Ted Cruz is pulling away. Right? And they just recently, I think, they just recently moved that out of the toss-up column. How good of them? How good of them? Cruz is going to win by more than double digits. Let's look at these other races that they still have in the toss-up column. In Arizona, Martha McSally. Look, I'm going to try to keep this short because it's getting late. What time is it?
7:35.
Oh, okay. I'm going to end this up. Just look at this over here. I want you to see. All of these races are shifting in the same direction as those graphs I showed you before. These races that they have as toss-ups or that were leaning towards the one side before are slowly, and in some cases not so slowly, all shifting to the right. And if I were to have to take the time to take you through this, the possible gain of 5 seats for the Republicans. And here's Nevada, which is probably the most at-risk one. And until recently, they had Senator Heller's challenger up in almost all the polls. Now, all of a sudden, in the last two polls, the only one's taken in October, it's the other way around. So it's going away. The wish and the dream is going away. All right, so we're wrapping up. 1, 2 more slides, that's it. The possible outcomes that we talked about. Here's what Electoral is going to project. Now, I'm going to talk about this on the radio. I'm going to talk about it on the television. And I'm talking about it tonight. But with the caveat, you understand, I'm still waiting for all the data to come in, right? I don't want to let my wishful thinking get ahead of me. So understand, okay?
If the Senate votes for confirmation, do not depend on Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski.
Right.
That is
Right.
a significant shift in the Republican Party in the Republican direction.
Correct.
And
So,
2 more votes, and the Senate is a completely different animal.
right. There's not going to be any significant shift in power in the following sense. The Democrats may take the House. I don't think they are. The numbers tell me they're not going to. But even if they did, they can go on and try and be. There won't be impeachment. To the person who was asking before, there won't be impeachment because if they take the House, it's only going to be by a slim majority. And there's still a few of them out there, but the common sense to know that they would be incurring the wrath of the American people and wasting their time because the Senate has to have a 2/3 vote on impeachment to convict. So I don't even think there'll be an impeachment. There may be a few lunatics who drive it, but the bottom line is Congress may not pass a bunch of laws. That's merciful, right? But I don't even think that's going to happen. In the Senate, the Republicans are going to pick up somewhere between 1 and 6 seats. I can't tell you right now how many, but as Ed just pointed out, that actually could constitute a significant shift in power. If they pick up 3 or 4, it's not a difference of the majority changing hands.
This whole Kavanaugh thing depended on Jeff Flake, Lisa Murkowski, and Susan Collins.
Right.
Turned out to be a straight shooter. And the fact that McCain was around.
That's correct.
And so you get 2 votes, and he will be able to nominate somebody that's not like a mainstream Republican voter, but a genuine conservative.
It will make it possible for the House majority, the Senate majority leader, and other officers, other chairmen of committees, to go ahead making assumptions that they've got the votes whipped. And let me tell you that even before the elections, there's significant change in that Flake and Corker are going to be gone, and McCain is gone. So that's going to be the replacement of 3 very iffy votes with 3 more reliable constitutional votes for the most part in the future. So if there's a shift in political power, it's going to be relatively minor in the number sense. But as Ed points out, it could be a significant shift in what it allows us to get done. So in summary, the Constitution addresses elections directly in several sections, Article 1 and in subsequent amendments. The 15th, 17th, 14th, 24. Other provisions affect our elections, like provisions for the census, for the way Congress men are apportioned, and subsequent acts and how the congressional districts are structured and drawn and populated. The results of our elections, in turn, affect how our Constitution. We all know this. You all know that. I'm going to guess everybody out there who's watching me knows this. But go tell somebody else. It affects how our Constitution is perceived and how it's protected. And that's what these people state in their oath of office when they take office. Are they going to preserve and protect the Constitution? So I think, again, if we were going to meet again in the next few weeks, I might revise this, but for the time being, it appears our Constitution, for the most part, because there's always a Jeff Flake and a Corker out there somewhere, for the most part, will be in the hands of those who understand its relevance. And for you out there online, that's we, the people. So thank you.
To ask you, what have you done on Jeff and Warren? What kind of statistics?
The polls, which are not going to be accurate, the one was just published today, has Warren up by something like 25 points over Jeff. So the question for those of you out there, we have a Senate election going on in Massachusetts. It pits the incumbent Elizabeth Warren, who I know you've seen on the international and national news, versus Jeff Deal, who is a solid constitutionalist by any measure. And this is Massachusetts. I have sad news for you out there. Jeff has got a long uphill haul. And even if that poll was off by 15 points,
It's still a lot of points.
Jeff is in trouble. So in races like that, I say, like I've said in the past, that you have to run the best you can, and you have to be there in case somebody in the opposition drops the ball. You got to be there and ready to cover the fumble, pick it up, and run it into the end zone. If that happens for Jeff, anything's possible. If it doesn't, we're going to be seeing Elizabeth Warren until 2020 at least, when she decides to run for president, and is soundly whipped by our incumbent president.
Amen.
So,
Do you have anything on the third?
what's that?
Do you have anything on the third
Of what?
district, Massachusetts?
Oh, no, is that green?
Right.
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't. I'm not following the Massachusetts congressional races. There was one, which of course I couldn't help but follow, which was the 9th congressional district.
Is there any point in that?
It doesn't really make a difference to me. I was
I
hoping,
mean, I just, typically, the Republican nominee falls asleep after the primary anyway.
well,
But that's not true in the third with Rick Green.
Who's the winner?
in this case, Green, he's a very active,
Rick Green is a businessman. He and his brother started about the third or second largest online auto parts. They employ a lot of people in Pepperell, rather than the Hampshire border in that district.
Okay,
He
so
started
was
the
that,
Mass Fiscal Alliance, which is the best watchdog group in Massachusetts.
was that the Songus?
Nikki Songus retired.
Is that said?
There was this huge fight on the Democratic side, between like,
Yeah.
I think originally 12 days. The vote was so close that they had to do a recount, which means they didn't declare a winner until the end of September.
Yeah.
And Rick Green has had a clear thing, and he's got money, and so I don't know. I'm kind of curious whether the Merrimack Valley disaster will swing any votes.
I get anything is possible.
It's not clear which way it would go.
In the 9th district, I don't think that formula could apply because this particular candidate is a reach across the aisle kind of guy.
This is Tedeschi.
And he's, I got an email from him. I mean, I was talking to him very early on in the race and ready to offer whatever leader support I could offer. But I also wanted to wait and see, is this going to be a real candidate or is this going to be a real Republican candidate or is this going to be just another kind of Charlie Baker sort?
Yeah.
Did I say that online, Charlie Baker sort? I did. Charlie Baker's a Democrat. In some respects, a decent guy, but he's a Democrat. And this congressional candidate is in the hands of our Massachusetts Democrat/Republican Party. And that's become apparent to me in my communications with him. And so when he talks about being bipartisan, his language isn't even right. You can't be bipartisan. You have to be schizophrenic to be bipartisan. You can be nonpartisan, right?
Yeah.
And every congressman should be nonpartisan. But that doesn't mean that you should adopt half of the other side's anti-constitutionalist principles. So I'm going to wrap it up because we've gone over time already. I just want to say to everybody out there, to anybody here, and few people who might get word of this, this was not a political partisan talk. This was objective analysis from a professional analyst. And I'm just here to tell you that in my humble, objective opinion, that election night ain't going to be so bad. I'll say that at least. And it may indeed be good. Pam, last question. If anybody wants to sign off or leave, please feel
Actually,
free.
not a question. Well, it is. Did I hear you have a radio station also that you're radio?
Yeah, and I just had Steve Negron. So the show that I had on WATD in Marshfield on the Mark, I'm now airing from WSMN in Nashua, New Hampshire. And in fact, this week I had Steve Negron on as a guest. So life goes on.
What time?
All right, Pam wants me to give a pitch for the show. It's every Tuesday from 11 a.m. until 1 p.m. in the afternoon on the Mark on WSMA 1590.
Kyle in Scotland. Kyle in Scotland said, "Don't sign off. He has insomnia and he's enjoying it."
Who's this?
The guy Kyle in Scotland.
Oh, we can keep talking. I'm going to let everybody from here be released. And yeah, Alice.
You know what the blue wave really means?
Yeah, it's what you see in a tiny bowl.
Well, when we wave goodbye.
Right.
That's what that means.
Yeah, and what's this fellow's from Scotland's name?
Kyle Murray.
Kyle, I just want to tell you something. We have a good friend from New Zealand. Well, good friend. He's an acquaintance. Help me with it, please. I'm blocking because I'm looking.
Trevor.
Trevor Loudon. He's an author. He's a
Oh.
former Parliament member, a member of Parliament in New Zealand. He's no other way to describe him, but a strong conservative. And if he were an American, he'd be an American constitutionalist. He's come and given talks to a number of the groups associated with this group. And I remember a couple of profound things he said to us about 5 or 6 years ago, about 6 years ago. He said to our Upper Cape Tea Party, he said, the world is watching you. There are people all over this world who are watching you Tea Party patriots in America, waiting for your lead. And so, Kyle, what I'm telling you is that we have led, with help from individuals like yourself, we've flipped this government. We have our first Tea Party president. A lot of people want you to believe the Tea Party is gone. It ain't. It's going strong. It's rejuvenating the Republican Party in this country. And with a little bit of luck, like Trevor said to us, someday we and you are going to be able to tell your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, or rather your grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to be able to say, my grandfather and grandmother helped save the United States. So thank you for joining us tonight, Kyle, and good night to everybody else.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes. Is he still on the line?